What I'm going to speak about this morning relates to a current project of mine called Rethinking Urban Nature, which is funded by the European Research Council. And what I'm interested in, what I want to talk about this morning, is some specific aspects of urban biodiversity and ecologies of endangerment. And as the starting point for my presentation, I'm going to use the example of a very rare fly found in a cemetery in North London, and I'll say a bit more about that. And part of the pretext for looking at this very rare insect is its association with old trees. So this term saproxylic ecologies will come into my presentation because these are ecologies associated with rotten wood or over-mature trees. And I'm very interested in what ecological rarity means in an urban context. And I want to say also something about counter-hegemonic taxonomies. In other words, grassroots ecological activism and the production of new sources of knowledge and what these may imply. So I'm going to kick off then with saproxylic geographies and make some comments about this very rare insect and some of the implications from that. Secondly, I want to look at the question of rarity and try to articulate what I'm calling forensic ecologies, and I'll explain a bit more about that. And then thirdly, I want to consider what kind of ethical or political arguments might be used to protect an obscure invertebrate. So saproxylic geographies. So this is the fly, Pacota personata. The thing about this fly, which was actually last found in London in 1963, rediscovered by chance in 2013 by a colleague of mine who thought it was a bumblebee, but it's not. It's a kind of a hoverfly that is an expert mimic of a bumblebee. It was originally described in the late 18th century as new to science, as from a dead specimen, but in fact the living fly buzzes like a bee. It moves its hind legs in a sort of irritated movement, also like a bee. So it's a remarkable example of what you would call a Batesian mimic in biological science. In other words, it's a harmless mimic that uses various forms of warning coloration or mimics a stinging insect. Now, this particular rare fly is associated with so-called rot holes. These are cavities in very old trees, and this is a diagrammatic representation. And as ecologists have noted, one old tree can support more interesting species than thousands of young trees in terms of the biological diversity associated with these old trees. And this site in North London, which I've been looking at very closely, subsequent survey work reveals that the fly, Pacota personata, is associated with just 4 old ash trees. Now, and here is one of my photos of the niches where this fly exists. Now, old trees have a very complicated relationship with modernity and the aesthetics of nature. For example, in the early 19th century, a very interesting set of illustrations from Jacob George Strutt in the early 19th century of very old examples of very old trees. And he describes an ash tree, another example here, an ash tree. This is from 1822, this illustration. This tree reputedly planted in 1596, and Strutt describes its playful ramifications and houses not built with hands. In fact, some scientists have referred to very old trees as not so much an individual abode, but a megalopolis, which is a nice urban metaphor used in relation to these old trees. Now, very old trees have a complicated relationship to the aesthetics of nature. On the one hand, their unusual forms are celebrated. On the other hand, in some philosophical reflections, they're also a source of anxiety. We have in European cultural history the medieval tree of rot that spews forth cosmic or strange beings. And certainly, in the case of our fly, Pacota personata, the larvae look like strange aliens with specialized breathing apparatus hidden within the darkened cavities of the tree. Then out of this tree emerges this dramatic insect. There are many beetles and other saproxylic organisms as well that have this very complicated and unusual life cycle. But old trees, in terms of European vegetation history, are some of the most vulnerable components of lowland ecology. Historically, such trees would be readily cut down for firewood. Under modern forestry techniques, old or fallen trees would be rigorously removed from the forest structure. So they're a very vulnerable component, if you like, of the ecology of particularly lowland areas or areas accessible to forestry or human intervention. And of course, historically, there are also major political conflicts over access to firewood as well. So in summary then, the old or over-mature tree is something of an anomalous presence within the modern landscape. So I want to say something now about how we might move from this example of this rare species to some broader conception of protecting urban nature. I think the anthropologist Tim Choi's use of the term ecologies of comparison related also to his focus on ecologies of endangerment. This is in a Hong Kong context, but I think an extremely useful way of trying to think through different relationships between discourses of protection and these complicated attempts to compare different levels of vulnerability in different sites and locales. And this sense then of an ecology or aesthetics of endangerment links with broader biodiversity discourse. And of course, in a contemporary context, the putative sixth mass extinction that is part of the Anthropocene debate. Now, our fly, Pacota personata, the Latin name personata, by the way, because it impersonates something else, our fly, Pacota personata, is a so-called indicator species for vulnerable saproxylic old woodland habitats. It's also on the so-called red list of vulnerable species in Germany, Sweden, and other European countries. So it's a fly that's rare everywhere, which makes it even more remarkable that it somehow clings on in a space in the middle of North London, just 100 meters away from busy traffic. So there's something interesting about the comparative dimension there. But of course, the notion of the species as a focal point for biodiversity discourse has itself been questioned by historians of science and anthropologists as to some degree a social construction. Nevertheless, the species forms the focal point of endangerment discourse, despite some of its ontological complexities. Now, the cemetery, this is Abbey Park Cemetery that I've been looking at, is effectively an urban island surrounded by the gathering pace of urban development. And during the period of doing my research, there was a proposal to build a high-rise luxury housing development and supermarket that would encroach directly into the cemetery itself and cause clearly massive ecological disruption, light pollution, noise, and so on. And this provoked various street demonstrations, local campaigns, but just to say, and it's a very complicated story, the way this political campaign emerged, is that the site, Abney Park Cemetery, doesn't have any legal protection on account of its very high levels of biological diversity. In a British context, the key instrument is a site of special scientific interest, a triple SI, and it seems that the national agencies charged with this responsibility for giving this kind of designation that can protect sites from various development pressures are very reluctant to intervene in an urban context where there are land use planning conflicts, that most of the sites that get this triple SI designation are particular kinds of cultural landscapes, typically in a more rural setting, chalk downlands, for example, things like that. And in fact, because I've been quite involved in this local campaign, with over 5 years of campaigning, we've yet to have a single site visit from Natural England, which is the statutory agency. But in a way, the plot thickens because me and my colleagues have now produced very substantial data sets about the hundreds of species of invertebrates, plants, fungi, and so on. But the question is where to send these, because local planning officers have no training in ecology. They're uncertain how to interpret the results. National agencies such as Natural England have been ruthlessly cut back under neoliberal austerity. They have very few scientists. They have very few people who can even interpret data. So the question is then, where does expertise lie in such a context? We have this wealth of grassroots ecological knowledge, but what to do with this information? And how does it impact on legal or political disputes? In the end, this particular development scheme collapsed for all sorts of complicated reasons, but the original developers sold the site with planning permission at a vastly increased profit. So now a new housing development is underway, but with a lot of different steps in between. And among the key things to emerge from the grassroots ecological survey work in Abney Park is the fact that the indicator species, in terms of European ecology, can be scaled up to produce ecological indices, these aggregate indices. And we found that the site clearly exceeds the national thresholds for ecological significance, this urban site. So the data is there. So the question is, how does data play out within the legal or political arena? And this is really where I want to link to the question of forensic ecologies. Now, there are two strands that I've tried to draw together here. One is the established field of forensic entomology, which is used to deconstruct crime scenes in very precise ways, with precise knowledge about the different sequence of insects involved in processes of decomposition. But I also want to link to the very interesting and important field of work described as forensic architecture by Eil Weitzman and his colleagues, and their interest in different forms of evidentiary materialism and a post-positivist framework in which knowledge is produced in a collaborative sense and is explicitly geared towards the possibility of using new knowledge to question power structures and decision-making. And Weitzman and his colleagues refer to field causality. Some of their writings do refer to plants as specific indicator species in relation to land use conflicts. But surely insects also can be brought into this analytical frame as ecological sensors or ecological sentinels, simply because the distribution and abundance of insects can provide a wealth of really important environmental data about processes of environmental change. Now, in terms of the future of Pacota personata in Abney Park, I mentioned the threat of land use development pressures. I should say that there are cultural heritage discourses that wish to clear away all the undergrowth and unsightly trees to restore 19th century vistas. So we have this strange sort of ecology as heritage discourse. There are also issues to do actually with invasive species, quite a dramatic photograph here of the rose ring parakeet, which has spread across London since the late 1960s, and certainly some field observations that the parakeets like to nest in some of these rot holes and even try and eat maybe some of these insects associated with them. And on top of that, we have the question of the globalization of plant pests and diseases. And ash dieback, which is now quite prevalent across Europe, is also significant in the UK. And it's predicted that ash trees themselves might be wiped out completely as a result of ash dieback. So a very complicated set of processes here, perhaps connecting with the notion of Anthropocene ecology as a set of denuded, simplified, and vulnerable, increasingly vulnerable ecosystems. So moving on now to my last theme, loving the alien, I want to think about some of the arguments that might be used to protect Pacota personata and other vulnerable invertebrates. When we look at ethical arguments for the protection of nature, a very interesting contribution, I think, is Roberto Esposito and his interest in articulating a non-utilitarian ethics to protect all of nature. He's very concerned with, if you like, biopolitical intrusions into the possibility for the protection of nature. But his argument has been questioned in the sense that he doesn't make a sufficient differentiation between those components of nature worthy of protection and those that are inimical to human interests. So to return to the question specifically of insects, which is really the focus of my presentation today, clearly there are dipteran vectors for disease, such as mosquitoes or houseflies, which for various reasons have been the focus of biopolitical interventions, clearly. So what to do then about those insects that are completely harmless? How do they fit in to some kind of biopolitical schema? So this kind of emphasis, if you like, on the eradication or ignoring of invertebrate biodiversity poses very complicated questions. In relation to discourses on the protection of nature, in Derrida's later writings, he extends a kind of neo-Benthamite concern with the suffering of the non-human, the suffering of animals, as a new kind of ethical pretext to enhance our care for nature. But can this neo-Benthamite concern with care for the non-human be extended to invertebrates and insects? This becomes quite tricky to articulate because often the neo-Benthamite paradigm is predicated on some degree of similarity in terms of the capacity for pain or suffering, for example, between the human and the non-human. So it becomes a rather complicated argument to extend. But I think there are some very interesting elements in terms of Derrida's articulation of what we understand life to be, and in particular, different experiences of temporality. So there's a kind of a phenomenological dimension to what life is and how life might be experienced. And in this sense, of course, invertebrates can be incorporated into a radically modified neo-Benthamite frame. I've also been very interested in looking at the work of the sociologist Ted Benton, who has over a number of years explored some of the tensions between neo-Marxist theory and the ethics of care for nature and animals. And part of the, if you like, the complexity of trying to extend the neo-Marxian frame to the care for animals is this nervousness, if you like, about potentially diluting or displacing an emphasis on the human subject as the self-reflective or conscious agent of historical change. There's this tension that permeates much of this writing. So the question then of protecting our fly Pacota personata, what kind of ethical basis might exist? I think one important strand would really come back to a question of phenomenological empathy, and in particular the way that care for nature can be imprinted in childhood memories and experiences. And in terms of thinking through the care of this fly and other saproxylic invertebrates, one possible line of argument, which is albeit an anthropocentric line of argument, is that these are organisms that are studied simply for their curiosity on their own terms, that these are organisms that actually give pleasure to scientists as human beings in the conduct of their scientific research, that these insects enrich human life and also form an integral part of the web of life itself. But of course, in articulating very specific arguments about the care for endangered insects, we need to also be aware of how culturally specific these arguments are. In other words, that these arguments for the protection of urban biodiversity need to be located in terms of their precise historical and also metropolitan context. So we're not dealing with generalities here, but with specificities. So we might be able to articulate then a kind of enlightened utilitarian framework in which these Batesian mimics, these harmless mimics, form part of the natural processes of decomposition and decay within the larger web of life. That clearly this species, Pacota personata, is not a keystone species. Its disappearance might not necessarily irrevocably alter many different aspects of a specific ecosystem, but nevertheless it has intrinsic qualities that are worth noting. We might also, from a legal point of view, and this interests me in terms of the difficulties of securing or implementing legal instruments to protect nature. If you like, our failure to get a SSSI designation and wider discourses about the use of law to protect nature, there's something of an ironic animism that exists in relation to law and environmental law, that we think of law in relation to human standing or the human protagonists. But of course, in terms of commercial law or tort law, organizations or companies are treated as legal entities. So we have this ironic animism, and in that context, why not build on recent interest in extending the law to either individual species or even components of ecosystems? A river in New Zealand is one example. So very complicated and interesting developments in terms of law and legal standing. Furthermore, in terms of trying to articulate a degree of empathy towards the non-human, and in particular invertebrates, I would invoke the notion of post-humanist life worlds. In other words, rather than trying to find commonalities between the insect world and the human world, although we do know, by the way, that insects dream and sleep and even have some components of memory, which is interesting. Nevertheless, we're dealing with an organism which is really fundamentally different from us at a very profound ontological level, that we know from these rot holes where the larvae of this fly exist, that they sometimes develop in a year, sometimes 2 years, sometimes over 4 years, so that you would have adult flies that have nevertheless had lifespans that were years apart, coexisting in the adult stage. Very odd and unusual temporalities, as well as different perceptual realms. So really not trying to subsume the non-human, but acknowledge the unusual and fascinating wealth of the non-human life world. And also in terms of the use of indicators, and this comes back to the notion of forensic ecologies, that indicators and ecological indices can be used in different ways. I see no reason why this kind of data can't be used as a counter-hegemonic tool in relation to broader environmental discourses, towards, if you like, a more affirmative biopolitical paradigm that explicitly acknowledges some role for the law or state intervention. So, to conclude, and this is a photograph, actually this photograph is difficult to see, taken from October 1979 in Abney Park, from a police officer on patrol who, weirdly enough, retired now, but I interviewed him as part of a larger project on the site, but that's another story. So to conclude then, is there some kind of saproxylic charisma when we think about the protection of nature and biodiversity? There are a lot of discussions about the way that some species get attention because they're interesting or attractive, but a vast majority are unknown or overlooked. Curiously, the discovery of this fly, Percota personata, in Abney Park has heralded a kind of fly tourism within London, that dipterists, these are fly specialists, now travel across London in the hope of catching a glimpse of this very rare fly that only appears in early May, and as we know, is only known to associate with 4 trees. So people are coming to have a look, so there's some interest in it. But this notion, though, of protecting old trees is really complicated to achieve in an urban setting particularly. There are growing legal anxieties about trees falling and hitting people. So there's a kind of a panic about trees that might be about to fall. It's quite difficult to keep these trees in situ. Another related problem is that the care and expertise, the arboricultural expertise to look after very old trees is beginning to fade. That certainly in the UK context, most municipal authorities have laid off their so-called tree gangs. They've lost a lot of local expertise. So it's very complicated and expensive to look after these older or oddly shaped trees in an urban setting. And in another British city, in Sheffield, in northern England, political war has effectively broken out over street trees because of thousands of trees being chopped down to make streets cheaper and easier to manage. So if you Google trees Sheffield, loads of articles will come up immediately, highly contentious debate going on. Another point I'd make about this study, and particularly Abney Park Cemetery, is its connection with an emerging field we might call geographies of death or necrogeographies. So an interest in graveyards, cemeteries, places of death, and also the notion of decomposition and decay within a broader conceptualization of urban space and urban ecology. Linking with that, we can also say that cemeteries, and I'm sure this is also the case in Brussels, it certainly is in London and Berlin and other cities, that cemeteries have become increasingly significant islands of biodiversity. Their significance has been increasingly recognized as being an extremely important component of urban ecology, and particularly remnant woodland ecologies within the metropolitan fabric. I mentioned a couple of times in this presentation this ongoing political campaign to try to get this triple SI designation for this site, some kind of planning protection for this site. And I would simply point out that even if we were to achieve that, which seems very remote, that in itself is not a kind of irrevocable protection. It's still possible for different levels of political authority to overrule these designations. If the site became heavily degraded or damaged, possibly it would lose that designation anyway. So it's not a kind of irrevocable step, but it's part of this broader context. And perhaps just finally, at a theoretical level, I'm interested in trying to think through some of the potential new directions broadly conceived within the urban political ecology paradigm. And I think one very important and perhaps overlooked strand is engaging with new conceptions of the non-human agency, and some of the interesting debates about so-called materialism, or particularly new materialism, as it might relate to these invertebrate assemblages in an urban setting. Okay, thanks very much for the invitation. Thank you.